friend of mine is trying to get back in shape, and she sent me this text last week. She'd made a bunch of food, she'd meal prepped, and she wanted to know how many calories were in the dishes she'd made. In online fitness, we tell people to track their macros, but we don't really break down what that means. And from the outside, it can seem weird, hard, and really frustrating. So in this video, I'm going to give you all the information you need to know so that you can track your macros. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what you actually need tangibly to track your macros. Then I'm going to talk about the two main strategies to do so, and then I'm going to talk about ways to make it easier. And I really want to emphasize to you, just like I emphasized to my friend, that even taking the first step is awesome. You don't have to get this right off the get-go. You don't need to live like a bodybuilder just to get in shape. These things aren't necessary. Just take it day by day and make gradual improvements, and eventually you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish. Okay. Practically speaking, what do you need to track your macros? Well, you need a digital scale, you need measuring cups, spoons, that kind of a thing, and you need an actual macro tracking app. I like to use Chronometer, there's MyFitnessPal, there's all sorts of tools that you can use. Most of them are free and very good. But you need some kind of physical way to measure the food you're eating, and you need somewhere where you can enter that information to figure out what the calories are. That's it. Additionally, depending on the app you're using, you may want a spreadsheet so you can track your daily macros, but that's not always necessary because sometimes that functionality is built into the app. Now, how do you actually track your macros? Well, there's two ways to approach this. One is by going by the food, and one is by going by the macros themselves. Each approach has advantages and disadvantages. So when I say going by the food, what I mean is that you simply make dishes and then you look and see what the macros are. And as your day goes on, you adjust your food choices based on what you've already consumed. So you make your breakfast and you see how many fats, proteins, and carbs are in that dish. You see how many macros you've got left for the rest of the day, how many calories left you can consume, and you adjust your dishes accordingly. This can work well for people, particularly people who like a lot of variety and flexibility. Of course, the problem is that if you overeat too early, it can screw up the rest of your day. You can get into this weird cycle where you eat all your fats first thing in the morning and then essentially have very little calories for the rest of the day. And I don't think that's great. I think that can be mentally debilitating and also just not a great way to live your life. But nonetheless, this approach can work. Secondly, you can go by the numbers themselves. So what I mean by that is that you pick your macros, you set your macros, and then you use those macros to choose your dishes throughout the day. This, I think, is what most bodybuilders do. This is often what I do with my clients, where I will actually provide them with set macros, and we use those macros to inform their food choices. This method works really well because it removes a lot of the day-to-day decision making, that fatigue you get from having to figure stuff out, from having to do math. The downside to this method is that you often end up eating similar foods all the time. And it is very common with bodybuilders. That's typically what I do, is that I sort of set up my basic diet and I adjust things up or down depending on my caloric needs. But those core dishes, those core macros remain constant. For me personally, that's not a problem psychologically. It's definitely not a problem physically or physiologically, but it may be a problem for you. You may be someone who needs more variety and just simply wants more variance in their day-to-day food choices, and that's okay. So going by the numbers for you might not be the easiest or the most advantageous. So now that we've talked about the different methods, how can we make this easier? Because I imagine this still might feel daunting to you. Well, the best thing you can do if you've never ever tracked macros is simply start to track macros. I know that sounds dumb, but what I'm saying is don't change your diet. Don't do anything different at all and just start to track. This will give you a sense of what you're already eating. And once you get a sense of that, this will start to make it easier for you to make informed decisions. So again, don't change anything, just start weighing it out. Practice that skill. Get to the point where it's easy for you to weigh things out, to measure them, and enter them into your app. If you do this for a couple weeks, you'll know precisely what you're eating and you'll know how to track. And this will make it so much easier for you to make changes in the future. Now, of course, there is a clear flaw with this method, and that's if you eat out, it becomes much harder to track. And that's just true. That's just true of macro tracking in general, particularly if you're going to fancy restaurants or even just a place where an actual human is creating the dish, right? Not fast food, but a place where there's a kitchen and a cook and they make the food. Those macros are inherently going to be unpredictable. Your chef is going to make that dish differently every day, and you're not really going to be able to track that. And so what that ultimately means, if you're someone who plans to live a macro-based lifestyle, you probably can't eat out every night. That probably makes it too difficult. You can still eat out frequently, and over time you'll get a better sense of the macros in your dishes. You really will, but at least initially I would encourage you to limit how much you're eating out so you can really focus on your macro tracking skills. Secondly, when we're talking about ways to make this easier, what I want to encourage you to do is to shift your mental framework. You actually want to start thinking about food as proteins, fats, and carbs. And if you make food choices where those macronutrients are separate, this will become much easier. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you eat a protein source, make sure it is a lean protein source that is primarily just protein and not mixed with carbohydrates and fats. When you eat a carbohydrate source, make sure it's primarily a carbohydrate source and not mixed with proteins and fats. And same thing for fats. And that way, when you're conceptualizing your meals, when you're making meal choices, you'll have a better sense of what it is you're actually consuming. So I'm not saying you can't have fat, I'm not saying you can't have carbs or proteins. What I'm saying is that when you're making dietary choices, choose protein, carb, and fat. Think about them as three distinct things. So let's take a couple of classic dishes and try to conceptualize this. So let's say you're making a sandwich and you've got turkey, cheese, bread, tomatoes, and lettuce, okay? If I were to conceptualize this just mentally, I would think of the turkey as protein, the cheese as mostly fat, it depends on the brand, but it's mostly fat, the bread as carbs, and the lettuce and tomatoes as either nothing or carbs. And so if you want more fat in that meal, you would increase the cheese. If you want more protein, you would increase the turkey. And if you want more carbs, you would make it a triple decker. You would add more bread. Let's take something else that's less clear so I can show you why certain dishes are harder on a macro diet. Let's think of pizza. So pizza has a bunch of different ingredients, right? But the primary ingredients are going to be the dough itself, the cheese, the sauce, and the toppings. So the dough itself is going to be mostly carbohydrates, the cheese is fat, the toppings are mostly fat, but there can be some protein in there. And then of course there's going to be some amount of added oil and fat used to cook that pizza. So when you think about pizza, really when you're making macro choices, it's mostly carbs and fat. There may be protein, there can even be a lot of protein on like a meaty pizza, but still it's really a fat and carbohydrate heavy dish. That's how you should conceptualize it. So if you're trying to plan your day and you're like, okay, I've got 100 grams of fat, well, it's probably all gonna go to that pizza. You're not gonna have room for fat anywhere else. But again, as long as you can conceptualize foods in this way, it'll let you make better and more informed decisions. Lastly, and I mentioned this before, one of the easiest things you can do to make macro eating more friendly and sustainable is just to limit your food choices. I'm not saying you have to eat the same foods all the time, but if you have a couple of core dishes that you can rotate in and out, and you don't have to think about those macros anymore, it'll be so much easier for you. So, for my friend who texted me, she made this dish that was turkey and some vegetables. If she likes that, if she likes how that tastes, I would encourage her to write down those macros and just remember this as an option. She doesn't have to have it every day. She doesn't have to have it every week, but whenever she knows she wants roughly 300 or 400 calories, mostly proteins and carbohydrates, this is a dish she can use. And if you do this long enough, you'll assemble a list of dishes. You'll figure out ways to make this work, and you'll sort of Jenga and jigsaw puzzle things together. And you won't have to be measuring constantly and using an app all the time. You'll just have a set of dishes that you rotate in and out, and that will be very easy and sustainable for you. Thanks so much for watching. I know that this can be really frustrating for a lot of people, so if you have any more questions, please reach out in the comments. Thanks so much. Appreciate you.